Good afternoon. Welcome to the Computer Systems Lab Colloquium. Our speaker next week, whose name will have to go unannounced because I can't remember it, but he's in Toronto and he's one of Von Pratt's PhD students. He's going to come and talk about processing 3D sound. He has a mechanism for taking a microphone array and gathering information from it in a rather clever way. Our speaker... Pardon? Announces on the web, and you'll get it in the mail if you're on our mailing list. Our speaker today is Bob Colwell. He is the originator of something which probably exists on most of your desktops. He was one of the architects and implementers of the Pentium Pro core, which has propagated itself through a wide variety of Intel processors. He's going to talk about what architects need to know, and we're going to have a good time. Bob, you're on.
I first want to point out, my opinion, I think there were 5 of us to design the P6, and Andy was one of the 5 sitting right there. So just want to let you know it wasn't just me.
He gets the blame.
Yeah, if it's anything broken, Andy did it, and if it's no. Let's see what this foil says. This is a historical comment foil, and what you're supposed to do is look at it and say, as time and years has gone by, the computer industry has done awfully well in terms of making profits because people liked the performance. Nothing was fast enough. And whenever something isn't fast enough or good enough on any dimension, and you can improve on that dimension, then you make money at it. And that's kind of true of any engineering endeavor, and it's been true of the computer industry for the last 40 years. Now the question that I pose for you is, what is this curve going to lead to? And I have a graphic. Hey, that's a pretty good, here's my graphic. Now, yeah, we get a pizza. I mean this in 2 different senses, right? I mean, one is that the damn things really are getting so hot that they're ridiculous. The other thing is charcoal doesn't cost very much, and it's not a kind of a commodity you really want to go compete with. So, you know, my claim is that there's something sort of fundamentally wrong with the way the car's pointing in terms of the computer industry at this juncture. And I'm going to sort of try to hammer that theme in multiple ways as we go along here. It's my personal belief that every computer talk should have this picture in it. It's somewhere just to remind you of what the wellspring is of our entire industry. And in terms of Intel speak, which is kind of the only one I know because I've been indoctrinated, these are actual sort of correct relative to each other die photos. And so, for example, if you go back far enough, now I had to use these because they're public domain. I can't use the latest and greatest, which would be a lot more fun, but at least I can get to 0.18 Pentium 4s. You know, that was on a website long enough for me to snarf it a few months ago. But if you go back far enough, the way you're supposed to view this is, there's the process technologies, 1.5 micron, 1 micron, 0.8, 0.6, and so on. So it improves with time. And then these are the chips that Intel made on those process technologies. And so if you go back to the 3D6 and you see they shrank it a little bit, and shrinking, of course, is a wonderful thing in this business because it benefits you in many directions at the same time. For some reason that I never did figure out, the 46 was an oblong kind of a form factor, which is not really what you want. So they shrank it once directly, and then they rearranged it so it got more square later when they realized that wasn't such a good form factor. The Pentium came along, and notice the thing that you should notice is how much bigger that chip is relative to that one, because the fabs at Intel really were cranking both of them out at the same time. And yes, they were charging a lot more for that chip, but considering what the yield was on the 46 at the time, it was sort of a nightmare. I mean, the guys at the fabs are being held to, you know, what's your contribution to my corporate bottom line? And they'd say, well, if that's all you care about, I'm going to make a heck of a lot of these little guys and screw this big one. I mean, the yield is way too low. It's way too much work. I can't crank enough out, charge enough for it. But, you know, the upper management of the company knows over the global sweep of time, this is how the business works. And you'd better be able to switch to this because he's going to have a shrink and he's going to have a shrink. And sooner or later, the old chip's going to run out of speed. And that's how it goes. And so as the next one shrunk, we did the P6. And then as that one started shrinking to smaller sizes, we did another one. Well, another thing that you have to watch out for is this thing at the bottom. You can't miss the process window. And that is another piece of the wellspring of the industry that goes once sort of unappreciated by people who don't work at large companies like Intel. The message for that is, while we're off busy, you know, there's a big design team with hundreds of people in it trying to figure out what these transistors ought to do, there's also people in the fabs that are figuring out what the fundamental process technology needs to do. And that's an engineering difficulty. That's a design project just the same way as ours is. And at some point, they're ready. They are ready to start running production silicon through their new process. At that very day, you had better have a chip for them to start cranking through their fab, because otherwise Craig Barrett himself will call you on the phone and express his unhappiness with you and his predictions for your career at that point. And it's really expensive if the process is ready and the chip is not. And so I don't know what other companies do, but what Intel does about that is they actually have 1 or 2 design teams that actually work for the fabs, designing whatever they think is appropriate. And they don't have to necessarily coordinate their idea of a roadmap with anyone else's. Because Intel tries to present a unified front, you can't necessarily see which of these chips came from those teams versus which came from the kind of team that Andy and I were on. But it really is true that they try to sort of backstop their own roadmaps, specifically because they don't want to miss the process window, because that's such an expensive thing to do. So that picture has worked really well, and it led to the exponential curve with all the money on it, and that's really fun. This isn't so much fun. There's reasons to think that we're pushing performance and clock rates too hard, and the main one, I think, is the power density in terms of watts per centimeter squared. I just built my home Pentium 4 machine died last week, and I spent 2 days building a new one, and it struck me again how much cubic volume inside this box goes to the CPU, and it's a size about that much, and that's not even all of it. You have to have a fan on the chassis to move the bulk air in and out so that the little fan can spray it right under this tiny little chip that's doing all the heating. As long as there's money dragging us down that path, we should follow it. But there's reason to think that the money's going to stop being there sooner or later. And so, that's my second reminder of the same theme. We're going to get back to it again, I promise you. And you'll notice some of these numbers get pretty high just for shock value. This hot plate one, when we were designing the P6, our local marketing guy literally gave me a coffee warmer. It was one of those 25-watt ones, and he put P6, what do you say, P6 demo unit or something on a little sign. That's his subtle way of saying, man, this is really hot. How do you expect me to cool this thing? Of course, 25 watts was the good old days now, but oh well. Now the other problem is that Moore's law used to be in some sense free, and there's important senses in which it is no longer free. So we've been doing this number of transistors doubling thing, and that's the very definition of the law. But we've also been doing it with clock rates, and we've been doing it with power. We've also been doing it with bugs, design errata. For some reason, someone should do a study on this one. It looks to me as though the number of bugs in a chip is relatively proportional to the number of transistors in it, if you leave aside the cache ones. We tend to get caches right nowadays, except for cache coherence stuff. Don't talk to me about that. That's the hard part, right? But in terms of just remember this, please, and give it back later, that tends to work. But the logic stuff, all the functional stuff, what's it mean to be an x86? How do you get the corner cases right? That is really hard. And so the number of bugs, you might think that as you keep designing x86s, you'd get better and better at it. But the problem is that they're really microarchitecture bugs that get you. The more complicated the microarchitecture, the more you're pushing up a hill, and the more entertaining the interactions are between all those little features you stuck in there. Another comment on that is when they did the 386, there was a fairly easy, 386 is the canonical easy microarchitecture nowadays. The 486 was a pipeline version of the same thing. So anyone who reads, the Patterson and Hennessy knows how that is supposed to work. I'll describe my foil from now on. Is this a problem on my end, or?
Cable may have come loose. We're back.
But for how long? The comment I was making was, you can point to a single big idea that was in the 386. The 486 was pipeline. The Pentium, the original Pentium, was a two-way superscalar chip, 2 pipelines, right? Plus branch prediction. P6 came along, said out of order speculative execution, and there's other stuff. And Pentium 4 came and said, how about 50 little things, plus replay, plus a few other things that I'll mention. The point I'm getting at is we're moving away from the one big idea guides all the design decisions to we don't have any big ideas that are sort of far enough down the path now, so we're going to take 10 or 15 or 20 smaller ideas and put them all together. And if each of them contributes 2%, that adds up to enough of a performance window, I still have a chip. The problem with that is, and we have lots of little ideas. We're not out of ideas. The problem is when you do it that way, the complexity follows that curve because all those little ideas interact, and you don't know how they interact. until you're down the development pathway quite a ways. And it's when the validation crew keeps coming back and saying, every time you stick new code in here and put a new revision of the chip, all this old stuff breaks in weird ways. Do you know what you're doing? And you say, no, not really. But, you know, we're doing the best we can in the face of tremendous complexity. So,
It's more bugs too because of that.
absolutely. The chips all have more bugs. This is true of software, too, as far as I can tell. I mean, complexity is complexity. And the amount of money that it takes to design these things is going through the roof as well. Now, if you're making a lot of money from it, you don't care. But if you put any credence in my prediction that sooner or later this game's going to sort of grind to a halt, that money won't be there, in which case we better have another game, because we can no longer, at that point, afford to even design the complexity, much less try to manage the bugs it creates. So the thing that I see happening here is observation one is exponential trends in general are not sustainable. You know, trees don't grow to the sky. Sooner or later, a curve that looks like that is going to fundamentally change. You're going to hit a wall and you're going to break. And we have at least 3, maybe 4, we could argue about them, but there's more than one here. The other comment that I have is I think usable CPU performance is no longer following all the difficulty that that left column implies. You know, every time you buy, well, the machine I just mentioned, my new Pentium 4 3 gig hyper-threaded 800 megahertz front side bus, that's what I built this week with only 1 gig. It's not as good as Dennis's, but and I've got it in my house. I probably have 8 or 9 computers, the slowest of which is a 300 megahertz Pentium 2. And if you just sort of do Word or email or things like that, you can't see the difference between those two. Or it's hard. I mean, if you know that it's there, you can tell. If you play leading-edge games, my kids won't play on anything but the newest machine. I mean, they know. The games care, but, you know, I don't know how many, I don't think you can sustain our industry on games. You can sustain a few million sales. That's about how many hardcore gaming addicts there are. And that's not a small chunk, by the way. Intel, for example, pays attention to those folks. But you can't run a $30 billion company on that basis. So I think, this is how it feels to me, is that this whole game has been so lucrative that as an industry, we're kind of afraid to try anything else. I know how incredibly difficult it was inside of Intel to sort of say, yes, what we're doing makes a lot of sense and is making a lot of money and the stockholders love it. Now, this is circa 1998, say. But a few years down the road, we need some other game. This one's going to end. I want to start adding real value in terms of, say, wireless or networking, for heaven's sakes. If every machine is going to be networked, then why not stick the networking, you know, paraphernalia on the CPU? Let's at least see if that makes sense. So as an architect, I think, hey, I had a good idea. Let's go find out. I visit the chipset guys and say, how about that? What would it take to take your design for an Ethernet controller and stick it on my CPU? And they kicked me out of the office. And they said, you kill my job. You're taking my job away. And we have a profit loss center, and we're measured on do we make money for the company. And if I give you what I know, I've got nothing to do. I'll be fired. And I said, yeah, but we're both wearing badges that have the same color on them. I mean, you know, sooner or later, if it's good for the company, it's got to be good for you. But if you organize a big company that way, that's the politics you run into. And that was true time and again. I don't think it's just Intel. I've worked at other places. I mean, you put a large group of people together, and that's kind of the natural reaction that pops out. So I think in a sense, it really is true that once you've succeeded at something, it becomes more difficult to do something else.
It sounds almost like an addiction.
It is, yeah. Failure, on the other hand, is a really good motivator to try something else, right?
Hey, let's try doing some failures.
You might, you don't necessarily have to try to fail. I mean, it seems to just come along. All right, let's see. So I wanted to make some comments on the 2 architectures that I know better than most. And I spent all of my time, this is my caveat, so you can color everything I say from now on. My caveat is I personally never worked on titanium. So you have to take whatever I say about it as a guy that it was at arm's length at best. We did have a lot of interactions, most of which were pretty exciting, but they weren't technical in nature so much as political. And so the IA32 stuff I have direct knowledge of, but the titanium stuff is kind of like, look what those guys are doing down in California. So some of the lessons that I think I learned from one or the other are common mode. They apply to both. Some are unique to one or the other, and I hope that that's clear which is which as we go along. And my favorite ones aren't technical. I mean, it's one thing. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, what does this architect do at a place like Intel, I would have said, oh, you run simulations, you look at what the simulations tell you, you fix what's broken, you try that, you keep doing that until the product has converged into something really exciting and sellable, and you give it to your boss, you get your raise, and you go and do it again. And there are some aspects of that job that match that paradigm. But the more interesting ones are not like that at all, and they certainly don't teach you some of this other stuff, or at least at the grad school where I went. And for example, knowing that the public is weird is something that I needed to know, and it did matter. I'll explain what that is in a minute. You might think, well, in some sense, we're all the public, and I'd say, no, you're not. You are not representative of those people, and I'll tell you why in a sec. And it does matter to CPU designers. Knowing who's buying your stuff and what they're going to do with it and what they think about it, it turns out to be much more important now than it did, say, in the late 80s. In the late 80s, if you sold a computer to somebody, they were a computer-savvy, technical person. They were going to be using it as a workstation or something, and they knew something. Nowadays, the people walk into Circuit City or whatever, and they walk out with a computer, and they don't know anything about how it works, and that matters. You as a designer have to know they're doing that, because you'll see my examples in a minute. All right, let's pick on Itanium for a minute, or several. My first proposal to the Itanium design team was to pick your targets judiciously. What was that architecture aimed at? In the beginning, the architecture was proposed as a complete replacement across the board of IA32 of all Intel chips, not necessarily the embedded stuff. But the general purpose computing, the belief really was that by 1997, that would be all Itanium, and they were calling it something else, IA64 at the time. And so they went off to design an architecture that would allow that to happen. Now, Hewlett-Packard was involved as well, and at the time, workstations weren't dead, and Hewlett-Packard was making a lot of money from workstations, so their input to the process was to supply some of the basic ideas as to how one could match a new architecture to a compiler and really max out spec marks. Okay, that was kind of the coin of the realm at that day, and with a heavy emphasis on workstations because HP liked workstations. They were selling lots of them. Now, the problem was that workstations meant floating point, and floating point's actually not that hard to get. I mean, floating point code tends to be reasonably well behaved, and if you can afford the number of pins on the buses and the bandwidth to feed the units, and you don't mess up on the latency of the functional units, I mean, you can get there. You can hit whatever performance number you'd like to hit. The problem is the workstation market went away when graphics got good enough on the desktops. You'll also notice it used to be you'd go to maybe you guys don't care, but I noticed you'd go to a game arcade, put the quarters in, and some of those games looked really spectacular relative to what you could do at home. It's not true anymore. Nowadays, you go get your latest NVIDIA card or whatever and plug it in, and your graphics are going to be better than what you see at the arcades. And when that happened, the workstation market just had no reason to exist, and it kind of just disappeared. So the emphasis on the Itanium aspects of the architecture that were related to workstations are now kind of like, why is that in there? And now since that market kind of went away, it became server only, which was sort of a good fit because after all, it did have this native large addressing space, which IA32 did not have, and that's a good market. I mean, that's a good match to the server market. It also is a good match in the sense that if you're trying to establish a new architecture in terms of its performance, being in the server market allows you to spend a lot of money to do that. I mean, you don't have to obey the desktop economics or mobile economics. The Itanium processor family, first several chips, maxed out the reticle size. You cannot physically make the chip any bigger. It also maxed out the performance, the power. They did not have a cooling solution that could handle anymore, so they cranked the clock back till it hit that power, and that's what you got. I mean, it was in the server space. Sure, go ahead, do all that. It's not a problem. But if you're going to compare architectures, you have to somehow subtract out that sort of leeway that you gave yourself. And if you want to do sort of I64, I32, which we always did, it becomes really difficult to do a fair comparison. Now, the other thing that gave me heartburn and still does to some extent is what instruction set architecture has ever survived as server only. 360 comes to mind, but that's because it's mainframe, right? And it's been around so long. 390. But okay, let's talk about the other ones. Let's see. MIPS has had problems sticking in the server space. Alpha, which I thought was a really good design, but it could not live as a server space. There's lots. I mean, Sun is going to try to do this too, as far as I can see. I mean, it is a lucrative market for computing, but it is a small market and it is a vertical market, and it's not clear how you're going to make an architecture float there when the architectures below you that are benefiting from the volumes of scale that silicon really likes are creeping up for free. They're coming up your tailpipe without even trying. And if they're going to do that, you've got no place to go up here. It's not your CPU that's limiting you up here. It's stuff that they have to pay for too, like DRAMs and disk drives and things like that. So my issue is, yes, maybe today you're selling chips that are server only for several $1,000s each, but what's going to happen in the future? Can you keep doing that? Can you stay ahead of everyone else? It's not obvious to me. And what if you think, as I do, that the future is actually mobile? Then you should have designed a new architecture knowing that. Or, you know, even if you don't agree with me, it's fine, actually. But pick your vision and then chase it. You can't pick everything as your vision. That's a recipe for mediocrity. If you can't pick your targets, you're not going to hit any of them. So that's my fundamental heartburn about Itanium, is I don't think it had a clear target in the first place. And I think they veered all over the place in the meantime. And there were also some new architecture gotchas. I think if you design, you know, if we took all the brain power in this room and we went off and designed a new architecture for a few weeks, there'd be some really neat ideas in there. But we need a way to figure out which ones to keep and which ones to throw out. And if you can't sort of do that, you end up with real trouble. The first proposal I would have is, whatever this architecture we would all go off and design is, let's plan not to sell it. Let's make a chip out of it and go test the chip and then say, whoops, that didn't work so well. Throw that feature out. Throw that feature out. This one's a good one. Develop it some more. Once we've done that for a few months, we're going to really know what we want the second time, and we'll be a lot better positioned to establish an architecture in this computing space. If you try to get it right the first try, I don't know how to do that. I don't think anyone can do that. You won't be proud of it, and no one's going to buy it anyway, right? I mean, they're going to be a little skeptical in the first place, which they should, but getting committed to architecture features that you thought would work, but you weren't really sure, and you stuck them in there, but you refused to sort of do the lab thing that I'm suggesting, and instead you sold it to somebody. Now you have committed those features for all time on the basis of one guy who bought 20 of your chips. It makes no sense. I mean, I think if you have the nerve to make a new architecture, then go for it, right? Do it right. Take the chip to the back room and pound on it. Alpha was reputed to have done that with their first chip. Pardon? Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to look at it. If you're going to establish an architecture, then do it right. The other thing is, it's really easy to cheat on the benchmarks. You know, it's kind of, maybe I shouldn't say cheat, but I mean, it's a natural human thing. I'm not accusing them of dishonesty so much as falling prey to human foibles. It's, you know, you really want this thing to work, so you're going to tend to show what's good about it, and you're not going to tend to harp so much on the stuff that doesn't look so hot. And so for example, I was the one and only Itanium planning meeting I was ever personally at was the first time that performance projections were presented to Intel's executives. And the performance projections were put up, and I remember looking at them thinking, those are pretty amazing. Where did those come from? I don't see how to hit those numbers. And so I started asking questions, and it turned out that one man had written one inner loop, 30 instructions long, tuned the hell out of it, and said that was representative of spec. I and F. I mean, one loop. And I said, I don't understand how you hand-coded that, so how do you know that the compiler can generate that code? If you can show me the compiler generating that inner loop across most of spec benchmarks, I retract my objections. And he said, well, of course I haven't done that. It's too early in the project. And I said, okay, that's fair enough, but at least tell the executives what an incredible risk you're asking them to take by basing everything on 30 instructions that you, of all people on earth, can write down and notice how they would work. And of course, that subtlety was lost on the execs. They just said, wow, those are good performance numbers. Can you hit those, Bob? I said, no. Okay. We're good. We're golden. Well, their compiler, the reticle limit, the power, I mean, it's really easy to miscompare on these things. So I really think you have to be careful to evaluate the features fairly. Things like predication, I'm not a big fan of predication. We tried some of that at Multiflow. The compilers had a tough time finding it, and the architects and implementers had a hell of a time getting it right, and without, you know, it seemed to cost every time we looked at it. You would just carry extra semantics around that made linkages between things you wish weren't there. And it's one of those things where if the compiler, put it this way, there are people within Intel who are working on Itanium that still believe predication is going to win big. They say, and these are compiler folks, they say, yeah, we suck at it today, but we're working and we're going to get good at it, and when we do, that better be in there. And I say, well, okay, you know, when that day comes, I am happy to put the effort in to, you know, make my chip do predication. But until then, it's a pain. Can't we like take it out, put it back later when you're good at it? They said no, of course. Things like bus width and bus speeds. That makes a big difference to any interesting benchmark, maybe not the old spec ones, but you know, real machines do care what the size of their bus is and how fast it runs, and the protocol overhead to get in on and off of it. And the reason that buses aren't infinitely fast is because it would cost infinite amount of money. I mean, you're talking real money for the pins, real money for the the receivers and the things you have to do electrically to route the things. And it's P6s. If you look at the dice, if I put the dice photo of P6 back up there, you can see the bus interface unit on there. I mean, there was a lot. There was because it was cache coherent. It had to do snooping. There was a lot of complexity in it. All that stuff, you have to be careful. I mean, if you're going to try to compare architectures, be really careful to normalize them before you start making claims. I argued this directly with Andy Grove at one point because he knew that I had reservations about the corporate direction with some of Itanium, and he said, well, I can't reconcile that against the fact that we've shipped some of these machines, and some of those users love them. And I said, well, if you want to say, can you make a machine that people love, of course, you can put anything in there, and if it matches their application perfectly, they will love it. I'm trying to say, if Intel as a company is going to base its future on that architecture, then you have to do it on an architectural basis, and that has to include economics. And right now you're comparing a server-based thing to a desktop-based thing, and it's going to always be like that, and it doesn't tell you what you need to know. I don't know if I got it through to him or not. He's a very smart guy, but it's subtle. It's easy to get this wrong. The other thing was, I was never convinced that a third of the die to get lousy performance was the right thing. That was the first chip. I don't know about the second one. Maybe they got better at it. It's entirely possible, because I just don't remember. But this is basically what the number was for the first Itanium, and it just didn't strike me as the right trade-off. It seemed to me that was nature telling you there's something wrong with what you're doing. It's too painful. And it seemed to me binary translation might, in fact, be a better trade-off, and maybe that's where the effort should be going. But that's not where it went then. But this fundamentally was the part that bothered me the most. It's like, okay, you want to do a new architecture. What's your time horizon? How long out are you planning for? Is it 3 years? Is it 50? Or do you just refuse to think about it? Refuse to think about it seems to be the default most of the time. The Alpha team explicitly said 25 years, which I think was neat. I mean, most architects I know, when they heard the 25 years, they rolled their eyes because they know we can't even look out 25 months. We're lucky if we can look out 1 year, and yet, these guys say 25 years. But after that, you think about it and go, well, but you do have to pick a time horizon. You may not like 25, maybe it's 20, maybe it's 15. But you know what? I think 10 is too short, and that's kind of what we got in the case of the Itanium one. If you screw this up, you start doing things like, I never liked the register windows in Spark, for example. I think it was, an interesting idea for the 80s that was difficult to carry into the future. Or making the branch shadow visible in the MIPS architecture. It was a neat idea for a couple of years, and then it was baggage, and you had to carry it. x86 has so much baggage you can't believe it from that sort of a source. So I'm not picking on other people's machines, but the point is that you kind of, I like the thought process that happens when you think down this path and say, what can I do today that would max out performance on my current benchmarks? But then what is the cost of doing that, and what will I have to carry forward? And then how seriously do I balance that against today's win? If you're Intel, you really definitely have to balance it. If you're a startup trying to get a new architecture established or something, I don't know what to tell you on that. I mean, that is so hard to do that I don't know if it's even possible. But I'm just saying the contingencies might be different if that's what's facing you rather than a company that's maintaining an architecture. One piece of humility for me is the fact that the internet kind of erupted less than 10 years ago, and it was right in the middle of the P6 project. And I can tell you for a fact, none of us saw it coming. I mean, we were, as techie as anyone else, and we were using email. But when I still remember the day I started using a browser in like 1994 and saying, oh my God, look at this. There's a universe out there. I didn't know that was out there. And suddenly I/O mattered a hell of a lot. Can you speak 100 megabit Ethernet? And we said, I don't know. We didn't know that was going to be important. So, and at least in the case of the P6, we didn't even look out 5 years properly. In hell, maybe it's 2 years, or else I would have invested in Netscape. Anyway, and sold at the right time, knowing what we know now. But kind of the point of that is design accordingly. Make sure that you realize that there's severe limitations on anyone's ability to look down the road, and try not to take on baggage you can't undo because of that. And then I planned the migration path explicitly. This was just my, if we're going to move to Itanium and we're currently sitting on IA32, what is the path? Are we going to just go ka-chunk and switch over? Or are we going to put intermediate chips that speak both languages? Is that even possible? And if you can do that, are there things in both architectures you'd like to change in order to facilitate the path? And, you know, there was a whole bunch of questions asked that never really got seriously asked. And I think they should have, and so that's my advice to you. Now, IA32 has a different can of worms. And this is an example that I mentioned in one of my Computer Magazine articles. Intel has succeeded in a large sense in pushing x86 into faster clocks and performance, which of course are different axes. The downside is what I'd call fragility. It's design fragility. As the more complicated these things get, the more fragile they feel when you're working on them. Not necessarily when you're using them if we did our job right. But I think, like, if you use the example of a thoroughbred racehorse, and you sort of look at the physiology of the horse, and you realize it's an incredible pile of strong muscles attached to really thin bones that are really light. And as long as it's running nominally, that system is great. It's as good as you're going to do. But if the horse stresses one of those legs a little too much, it snaps. It's not a draft horse. It's, you know, it's fragile. So the speed comes at a price. That bottom thing is
And they get chopped.
and then they get eaten, turn into glue. No, I'm going to skip that. I'm not even going to. High-end classical guitars have a thing called a French polish, which they put on the wood with lots and lots and lots of applications of really thin lacquer. They kind of put it on flake by flake. And when they're done, the finish is incredibly thin, and it sounds really good. And if you wanted to put your initials in it, you could just use your fingernail. No problem. It's really quite delicate. But that's what you have to do to get good sound out of it. So again, it's a fragility thing that you know, there's a reason for it. It strikes me that there's a sort of a universal law of nature here that applies to CPUs as well. And the more complexity, it just seems like they go together. My experience with these chips has been that that's what's happening. So what that leads to is a fix one, break two kind of a situation. And it's partly a function of the design process itself. It takes you, from a standing start, you start, you know, designing a microarchitecture. Maybe a year goes by, and now you know sort of what you want. You start writing RTL. Another year goes by until you have a model that does anything useful. It just takes that long to design the damn things, especially with a big design team at a place like Intel. Smaller companies can probably do it a lot faster. But those are kind of numbers that it takes Intel. And the problem is if you're that far into your design schedule, and only then the model is now healthy enough to hand to your performance analysts, then they go off, and 6 months later, and they come back and say, you know what I found? Your chip is kind of slow on this following interesting things, and you better, you know, what are we going to do about that? And by this time, you can't say, oops, you know what that is? That's a fundamental flaw in the, you know, branch prediction at the front end of the machine. We have to repipeline this entire thing. You'd have to tell, that's equivalent to telling your boss, we just delayed the project by 2 years, right? They don't like to hear that. What they'd rather hear is, well, you know, we had a really bad problem today, but so we had some real clever ideas, and we think, you know, we stick them in there, and we're going to mostly deal with the problem. I think it's pretty much taken care of. They'd rather, you know, they kind of look at you funny, but then they say, okay, good. And the problem is, of course, now you have to do it at this point. So what you do is you stick this tweak in there, and you're adding complexity onto complexity. And each little tweak you stick in there is going to interact with every other tweak that you or anyone else stuck in there in some way that you don't like, because they never add up positively. They always interact badly. So it's really easy to fix one problem and create two more. And that's not always even bad. I mean, if you have one big problem and you fix it by creating two little ones, maybe that's okay. Because you know, the tweaks that fix the little ones are easier to do. But that's normally not what happens. Instead, you fix one big one, and you create one small one and one mystery one. And as time goes on, the mystery gets bigger and bigger, and you go, oh, man, we were better off before. The other problem with it is that this complexity narrows down the pool of people who are qualified to figure out what's wrong with the machine. In the P6's case, you know, my estimate would be we had maybe 15 people that understood enough of the machine to sort of tackle anything. In the Pentium IV, I think that pool was about 3 or 4 people total. And as we kept getting further and further down the road, it was more and more difficult for any one person to get enough of the machine in their heads and stay current with the project, because projects never stop, right? People keep adding and adding and adding. That the pool of people to tackle the really difficult problems got smaller and smaller. And I think that's an issue, too, because you can't really fix that one with a bigger team. It wasn't that we didn't have the people. It's just that, you know, their brains weren't large enough. So we were really nice to those 3 or 4 people. At least I think we were. And in some sense, I think the universe really is conspiring against us. You know, as engineers, I think that's a really good attitude to take, a good assumption to make, is that the universe is not helping you. If Mother Nature can find a way to point out the flaws in your design, she certainly will. And your job is to try to prevent that as much as you can. I'm kind of interested in this idea of chaos, and I've read enough of the books to only become minimally dangerous with it. But one observation is P6 is a self-scheduling engine, Pentium IV even more so. You can only sort of suggest to it what you'd like to have it do, and it marches off and does all kinds of things on your behalf that take hundreds of clock cycles. And so it's a self-scheduling engine, and it has deep pipes. Well, there were interesting interactions in the machine with respect to the reservation station scheduling policy after the micro-ops entered the core of the out-of-order machine. And then they were sitting there, and there was the equivalent of a daemon trying to pull out micro-ops that had their operands ready. But it wanted to pick, suppose you had every slot in the reservation station full of micro-ops, all of which were ready. Now, which ones do you pick? You can only dispatch a certain number of them based on hardware limitations. If the reservation station scheduling daemon had perfect knowledge of the critical path through the code, it would know which micro-ops to grab. But it doesn't have anything like that. So instead you give it heuristics, like maybe the first guy in ought to be the first guy out, or whatever's easy to implement in hardware. But whatever the heuristics you end up with, they interact with things like I/O and the memory ordering buffer design in really amazing ways. And you can kick this thing into a mode where it is actually running much slower in terms of throughput, and the effect lasts for hundreds of cycles. It doesn't just die away when the perturbing event comes and goes. The effect of it sets the machine up in a different way, and it just keeps going slowly for a long, long time. And if you're really unlucky, by the time you start recovering from that one, another one comes along and kicks it again, and it stays in the slow mode, and it's really ugly to watch. Sometimes it took, there were cases where we saw thousands of cycles go by before we felt the machine had sort of revved back up to the normal throughput that we were looking for. And when you see this, once you've analyzed this kind of a problem, all the way down to the clock cycle that caused it, you can relatively easily see what to do about it. You can say, way back here in the distant past, if we had just done the following scheduling a little bit differently, all of this would have been prevented. The next 2,000 clock cycles would have run twice as fast. Okay. What can I do in this clock cycle to recognize the onset of the slow pattern? That's the real trick. That is really hard to find, because a lot of times you can find one case where it helps, and as soon as you implement it, you put it in there, and now you've caused a new case you didn't have before. And so now it's a statistical game. Which one is on average better than the other one? That's really hard, because all you can do is simulate your way out of that hole, and the simulation cycles are expensive. Pentium IV has the same thing, only worse, because it's deeper, it's more complicated. In this case, for example, Pentium IV uses its L0 cache before the tags have been checked. It's a form of speculative, execution. And of course, you have to check sooner or later. You can't really. If you know the solution to that, tell me. But eventually you check it and you say, "Whoops, it was right. Boy, we're ahead of the game," or "It was wrong. We have to do something about this." And you send it back around for another try. And you keep on doing that. If it keeps coming up backwards, you keep sending it back around. But when the micro-op comes back around, it's joining a stream of new micro-ops that are flying in from the front end. And the way in which you merge those two matters a lot in performance, in chaos effects, in pretty much everything. And again, depending on how you do this and what code you run, you can see slowdown effects that last a really long time. And my proposal to you is this is an unsolved problem in machines this complicated. I've even seen this done at an industrial engineering level, where people are scheduling machinery on a factory floor, and they discover that the way in which you schedule these machines can also yield slow paths and fast paths. And sometimes, in order to avoid the slow path, you inject delays, which feels really counterintuitive to most CPU architects. But sometimes slowing something down speeds up the process. Knowing when and how much, that's the trick.
Actually, injecting noise, you're randomizing some effects. Not
That's a good idea. We didn't try that.
Like dithering, if you wish.
Yeah.
The smallest level.
Both IBM and CDC processors did that.
The processors themselves.
Yeah, CPUs.
Yeah, well, we may have to reinvent that stuff. It's needed. Now, I promised to tell you why the public was weird. One example is FDiv. You guys remember what FDiv is? When you hear FDiv, you think, $500 million, because that's what it cost Intel. But it's instructive to see where that number came from. Management said they got the Pentium working, and it had borrowed the design of the floating point divider directly from the 46, where it was known to work, where you know what it means to be known to work. They had not had to replace it yet.
Has known bugs.
Yeah, it has known bugs.
Unknown bugs.
as opposed to the unknown dangerous kind of bugs. And so they had borrowed a known working design. So the engineers dutifully went off and searched for opportunities to make the chip smaller. The floating point divider guys had a brilliant idea of some of the lookup tables that they had didn't need all those terms in them. So one of them said, well, I really think you can get by with fewer terms in my PLA, which would shrink it. A friend of his said, I can prove that what you just said is correct, and did a formal proof. You have to put the quotes around formal proof in this case. And the reason that's significant is because validators are smart, and normally they say, if I see your fingerprints on something, I know you broke it. I will assume that you broke it until proven otherwise. But you did a formal proof that's right. Well, I've got a lot to do. I don't have to test things that are known to be working, so I'm going to let you slide on this one. Unfortunately, of course, it was not okay to yank the terms out of the PLA. The proof was wrong. The validators didn't test it, and it got through into the wild. We found the bug actually while designing the P6, and discovered. We passed the information on down to the Santa Clara guys, and about 3 or 4 months later, Professor Nicely found it. And at this very moment, the World Wide Web had woken up and provided an easy mechanism for people to compare notes as to whether their brand new Pentium was broken or working. And so, for the first time, naive, non-technical people could call up Intel and say, well, I don't know what's wrong with my chip, but I downloaded a test from the internet and it's broken, I want a new one. And they had never been able to do that before. So this was the discussion that went on. The public said, I paid for a fully working chip, but you give me one. Intel said, nothing is bug-free and this bug doesn't affect you. They literally did. It seems kind of weird now, but the public said, I will judge severity, not you. I don't trust you to do it. And Intel said, we've always done it before and you can't. Which in some sense is true, right? But so then the public said, stand behind your brand or you're going to pay, like Johnson & Johnson, has to recall the aspirin and things like that. And Intel finally got it and said, okay, we give up and we'll bite it. And the weird thing was, Andy Grove told me this himself, that the executives finally got it, that these rules had changed from the old days, when somebody pointed out to him that if he bought a new car and he went to pick it up and he saw a big scratch on the driver's door, and he could have said to himself as an engineer, he could have said, well, the gas mileage is the same, the cargo capacity is the same, the top speed's the same, the radio still works. What's not to like? But are you going to take the car home? No, you're going to say, fix that. I paid for a perfect car. You give me one. And so as soon as his marketing guy pointed it out to him, he said, oh, we have to recall the silicon. This is crazy. We can't fight the public this way. Now, here's the weird part. In the end, it didn't save any die area. Now, think about that one for a minute. You have a chip this big. You have a floating point unit in the middle of it this big. If you shrink the floating point unit this much, what did the die do? Nothing. If you take Ohio out of the United States, Canada and Mexico are just the same distance apart as before, right? It's like, what are you thinking? But this is a $500 million screw-up, and it started all the way at the top level of management when they did that. It's like, if it doesn't save any die area, then don't take the risk. And then the other thing was, it ended up being a net win, because it put the name Pentium on everyone's lips, and it convinced them that Intel would stand behind that brand. So $500 million bucks, that's a reasonable sized marketing campaign, really. That's the kind of money they put into those things. So in the end, they were smiling, but boy. Okay, here's the other one, CPU ID. Marketing. So on wafers, the manufacturing people like to uniquely identify the spots on the wafers. Every single chip on there has its own unique bit pattern, okay? They do this at the fab because that's how it helps them improve yield. They want to know, is it always this corner over here that's not working or what? So they already had the ability to uniquely identify every single die on a wafer. And marketing found out about it and said, hey, we can use that. We've been asked for that feature by so many people, Microsoft, for example. Could you please uniquely identify every chip you make, because then we can tie our software to that chip, and we can do licensing stuff. It'd be really cool. So marketing guys say, being nice to your buddies up in Redmond is always a good idea, except when it's not. And so let's give them what they asked for. And so they came to us and said, we want you to turn the manufacturing ID numbers into a real product. And we said, well, first of all, you cannot call it unique IDs. The word unique has a legal meaning. It has a mathematical meaning, and you can't meet it. Because Intel, for example, has fabs all over the world. There is no central repository of ID numbers. There is only the intention to make each one unique. And for manufacturing purposes, if they mess up and they give the same numbers on a single wafer, they don't care. Put it this way, those chips are $1,000 each. Are they going to refuse to sell one because their manufacturing number was wrong? No, they'll sell it. So we said, you know, you cannot call it unique because that really would be grounds for getting sued later, because it could happen that these chips all have the same number. So they just renamed the feature, and they said, okay, we'll call it serial ID. And we couldn't convince them to not put it in. We really didn't like the sort of the last-minute aspect of, not well thought out aspect of this thing. But they really wanted it, so behind their backs we stuck a way to turn it off if we needed to as chip designers. So we put it in, and it ended up in the Pentium III, and people all over the world went crazy. I mean, they were out in the streets with signs, you know, down with Intel, you know, death to chips, death to the Pentium III. We just looked at each other, and none of us had a clue why there was a strong reaction. So here's kind of the way that I felt that this conversation went. The public said, I don't want you tracking me on the web, which we hadn't really thought about much, but we said, well, that's not what it's for. It's so we can identify Intel customers and for anti-piracy. And the public said, I don't want anti-piracy, and I don't want you telling me that I do. And we said, well, but, you know, there's already stuff in there, like your MAC address that is unique, and you weren't paranoid about that. And they said, shut up. I mean, the technical discussion ended right there. I want what I want. It was really kind of strange. Oh, and the identify Intel customers thing, this is to show you how out of sync we were with how people felt about it, at least the loud people were. With a week before the Super Bowl, this is when this happened, in whatever year this was, and there was an Intel marketing campaign that was all set to run at the Super Bowl, okay, 7 days away, and it cost them millions of dollars to buy this time. The point of the ad was to be this: if you buy our Pentium III and you come and visit our website, we will be able to reach across the net and tell that you're running a Pentium III, and then we will let you into our site and track you from then on, so that we can sort of send you coupons and stuff for more Intel stuff. Okay? Wouldn't that be good? And and you can imagine when people are saying, you know, I don't want you tracking me, went, oh, this campaign's not going to work. So they pulled the plug on it and sold it to somebody else. I don't know what they did with it. But, yeah, CPU ID was a mess. And the other thing was, this was Intel taking a business risk for other people. I mean, they weren't going to get any, you can't sell the chip based on that feature. There was never an intention to do that. But in effect, we were taking a business risk for that software. And Intel and everybody else just did not see this coming, that they were going to touch a raw nerve like that. And so they backed off really fast. The feature's still in there. It's just that they don't advertise it anymore, which seems to have calmed the effect down. No one pays attention anymore. Anyway, but that's where I learned the public is weird. It was difficult for me, even having been there at the time when this happened, to have seen this coming. And even looking back on it, I still don't completely understand where that came from.
Two of the 526 architects are weird in that same way. Fetterman and me were.
Yeah, but I knew about you. Yeah. The public and Andy are weird. All right. So the other thing I discovered along the lines of sort of doing chip architecture at Intel was that it puts you in a position to go out and talk to an awful lot of people. Networking companies, other chip companies, software companies especially. Visits to Microsoft were routine. I mean, we went lots of places. And at the beginning, the idea was a two-way street. We tell you what our new chip is likely to do, what the feature sets will be, the performance, and things like that. And then you will tell us what your vision of where your part of the industry is going to go. And then we'll go back and mull on that and see if we're aligned. And if we're not, we'll figure out what to do about it. You know, and it's a way to keep the industry synced and moving forward. So we visited lots and lots of them. And the shocking thing for me was the second bullet. By far, most companies' planning horizon's a few months. I mean, there is no strategic long-range vision here. There is, you know, my team is working on this, and they finish 3 months from now, and I've got to figure out what they're going to do then. And that's kind of, oh, and Intel, thank you for your vision, and now that I know what your chip does, well, by golly, I'll design a product around it, and I hope we'll both be happy campers. That's more or less what these. The one networking company gave me a different one, and theirs was, I won't tell you who it was, but theirs was, you know, the 386 is a pretty good chip. It's as fast as we're ever going to need. And that was the vice president told me that. And I just kind of looked at him funny and said, you can't mean that. And he said, oh, I'll show you. And he said, see how fast that was? Why do I need to go faster? And I said, that's not really the issue. The issue is Moore's Law will, at least for the next 10 years, keep creating faster CPUs, basically at the same price as that 386, probably cheaper. And when that happens, if one of your competitors finds a way to use that additional speed in a way that you didn't, you're dead. So it behooves you to make sure there's no such way, because if they find it and you don't, you're dead. And he just kind of looked funny. And then he said, you know, I always wanted to ask you about the corner case on the SAHF instruction. And it turned out he was a real hacker. He had done a lot of the coding himself before he was promoted. And so we switched topics and launched into some other completely different thing. And I went home and said, oh my God, they're in trouble. The other part, I thought this was, pardon?
They're still in the market.
Yeah, they still exist, actually.
No longer in Utah.
Who invited you? Moving right along. Number 3 is another one that I thought was really, really funny when we ended up visiting an operating system company and finding that the group that was doing the legacy code that they were selling oodles of was on one side of the table, and the group that was designing the next generation operating system was on the other side. And these teams were a lot more interested in killing each other than talking to us. And I swear at one point I was ready to jump on the table and just try to separate them because I thought there was going to be bloodshed. I really did. It was at some point the Intel guys just looked at each other and said, we're not really going to get a lot out of this meeting. We should probably postpone it for another time. This one, you might think I made this one up. I didn't. There are hardware companies, really honest to God, show up and say, well, we like your proposed new chip, but what we really want you to do is stick a couple of secret instructions in there that you don't tell anyone else but us, and then we'll be that'll be really help our business. And we said that indicates complete lack of understanding of how the silicon business works. That we ship volume. We don't really care who buys it, but we ship volume. And if you want to ship volume, then you're our favorite customer. But if you just want to sell 20 machines, you're going to have a hard time even getting me interested. And at one point we told them, if you're willing to sign on the dotted line that you will buy every single top bin chip we can make at a predetermined price, then at least we could talk about it. But you know what? Secret instructions don't stay secret very long. And how are you going to prevent those chips from getting into other people's hands? And this whole proposal doesn't make any sense. But it actually gets, that topic comes up all the time. Government agencies always want find leftmost one, pop count, yeah, centrifuge. It's like we should all work for the CIA or something. I don't know. Do they have any secrets? I mean, it's the pattern's always the same. Total I/O. Anyway, I have some gross generalities for you. I'm worried that microprocessors in general are outstripping the general performance demand, and that we're not noticing it quite too much yet because economics tends to hide it, right? As long as systems keep getting cheaper or they improve on some other axis. My personal history claim is that the Pentium, the original Pentium, I think a strong reason why it survived its maiden voyage was PCI and CD-ROMs. Those two things came along exactly at the same time as the CPU did. And people would buy a machine, and you'll notice if you look back in history, Intel didn't ship machines 486-based that had CD-ROMs on them or PCI. They purposely didn't because they wanted to sort of package it all together into a compelling thing. And as marketing goes, it's brilliant. It worked just fine. But if you're a CPU architect, you know there might be a lesson hiding in there that's worth paying attention to. But what if you had to sell that generation of processors strictly on behalf of your CPU? What if you didn't have these fellow travelers to carry you along? Could you have done it? And I'm not sure that's true in the case of the Pentium, because if you recall, as in-order superscalar, you have to have a compiler. You know, if you don't recompile, you're pretty much running at 46 speeds. So, and getting the industry to recompile is incredibly hard. It was harder then than now, but it's not something you really want to cast your business plan on. Well, so we could argue, is this outstripping performance demand happening now, or is it going to happen later? And of course, I don't mean it across the board. We could always cook up apps that always want more performance. But that's not what drives the industry, right? What drives the industry is whoever's out there buying hundreds of millions of chips a year, and that's people walking into Fry's, walking into Circuit City, Best Buy, and places like that. And if those folks stop doing what we want them to do, our business changes radically at this point. All right, so we could argue about whether the performance is getting outstripped, but I think it's reasonably clear that the power and economics are starting to suffer. And so my claim here in yellow is we're trying to fix that by applying exponentially more resources to the problem, both money and people, driving up clock rates by more complicated and less efficient microarchitectures in an effort to provide higher performance that most people can't perceive, much less use. And I don't think that's a rational plan. I think it's a habit. And some habits are good. Pardon?
An addiction.
It's an addiction, yeah. So, in fact, it feels that way sometimes, like when you're designing these things, like, it's almost like, pushing drugs on people. But sooner or later, this is costing people real money, and eventually they'll stop spending real money if there's not a compelling reason to do it. So My claim is business as usual is going to work until competition appears that adds real value, and at that point, there's going to be real trouble. So my adjuration here is that architects have to take the long view. And surprising to me, I will just pass it along to you, if architects don't do this, no one else will, including management. You might think that the managers are, they're in place for a good long time. They should have a nice long-term view of where they want to go, and maybe you come along as an architect and fill a couple holes in their roadmap for 10 years, but they're thinking 15, 20 down the road, and someone else will come along after you. And it isn't like that at all. I mean, what actually happens is their time horizon or their planning horizon is really short, and yours is way longer than theirs. So it's really easy for them to make mistakes that you can see temporarily aren't obviously wrong, but long-term don't look so hot. And now it's your job to bring to their attention the implications of the choices they're trying to make. And even marketing, in some sense, you might say, well, isn't it marketing's job to sort of think about higher level abstraction ideas as product level, rather than just the CPU in the product? And there are marketing people that are that talented that will do that, but they're relatively rare. They're pretty rare people. And so in some sense, if anyone's going to look down the road, it's going to be you as an architect. And so my claim is an architect's job is to make valuable products. You can easily get the impression at a technical school that your job is to be clever and to think up neat ideas that can get patented, and the more of them that show up in the silicon, well, then the cleverer you must have been. That's not entirely wrong, actually, but it isn't the entirety of your job. And in fact, it's the wrong focus. The focus ought to be on selling what you make. And if you think in terms of, I want to sell as many products as I can and make them as compelling as I can because that drives the price up, that will lead you to ask the right technical questions. If you come at it the other way around and start with the technology, it's like putting blinders on, and you can easily get blindsided when that happens. This blue crystals, does anybody remember people used to sell laundry detergent on the basis of blue crystals? And they would say it's new Tide with blue crystals. And the blue crystals really didn't do anything. They just kind of glittered. You shine light off of them and they look glittery. And it's kind of like, new improved. That was always a marketing, supposed to be a wonderful marketing thing. We were literally asked at Intel as architects, would you please come up with blue crystals to add to the CPUs? So that even if people get tired of performance, they will still be willing to pay for the blue crystals. An example of a blue crystal might be a security feature, something that you can base a security scheme around for secure transactions of money online or whatever, a non-performance thing, right? And that might be an example. I wouldn't call that necessarily a blue crystal because that actually would have, that would be useful if you get it right. But they were willing to settle for real blue crystals if you could just come up with them. Here's an example of what I would call a blue crystal. Would you please make it possible to turn off the floating point units so that we can add them back in later and then distinguish the two parts, with and without, and then we'll charge more for this one? And we said, no. In the case of remember the 386, 387 days, anyone who's old enough knows you bought a floating point coprocessor. Intel sold a lot of those, made a lot of money. They really like that. So they have a long memory, and they say, do that again. I want to do that again. That was a good game. And we said, well, our chips don't work like that anymore. If you can't schedule them properly, and that's how the machine works, if it's too far away electrically, it doesn't do any good. You can't really stick it off board like that. Now, if you want to design a attached FFT processor or something, yeah, we could do that, but how many people want that? It's probably pretty small. So they really didn't like that story. And at one point they taught us, the marketing guy said, okay, who brought a bunch of the technical leadership together in a room, and they said, okay, who in this room drives a Lexus? And a couple of people put their hands up, and they said, why did you pay extra money for a Toyota? And I wasn't one of them, so I just got to sort of snicker. But his point was most of the nuts and bolts and everything is exactly the same. It's just the trim is different, and you've paid for the, for the cachet of a luxury car. And he said, okay, that was one example, and you guys think you're rational, but you did it. You fell for this marketing. And they said, here's a more subtle example. You always want 3 products in your product line. You never want 2. And you certainly don't want 1. So if you have, the example they used was Wendy's. And they said, Wendy's has singles, doubles, and triples, burgers. How many slabs of beef are on these burgers? And they used to have all 3, and then they quit making the triples because they weren't selling all that well. And they discovered when they did that, doubles went away as well. And they said what happened was people were walking into the store and saying, well, I'm sort of hungry. Maybe I want a single or a double. I don't know which. But the single is certainly cheaper. and it's not clear if it's a good value for the money getting the double, so I guess I'll just go with cheaper. But if you give them 3 choices, now they say, okay, the top one is the pig-out one, the bottom one is the cheapo one, the middle one's probably what I want, and they buy the doubles. So they stuck triples back on the menu so they could sell doubles. And then at this point the meeting stopped and they said, okay, so do you get it? And we're designing CPUs. We said, no. Well, what does that have to do with us? And they said, well, you have Pentium 3s at the top. This was a few years ago. You have Celerons at the bottom. We have Xeons, but no one knows about those except server manufacturers, so they don't really count as the third thing. So we really only have 2 things, and people are all buying Celerons, and that's bad. And you have to fix it. So we need ways to differentiate the Pentiums from the Celerons in such a way that we can put the proper value on these 2 product lines. And that was the blue crystal discussion, was, think up cool ways that the Pentium 3 will have cool features that the Celerons won't. So at least they got our attention. I don't really think technology goes that way easily. It's awfully hard to think of non-embarrassing things you can do to a chip that would yield that split that they were looking for. Cache is always the famous one, right? You put less cache on the Celeron and you say, of course it's cheaper, the die size is smaller, so the yield is better and the performance is, and it's still pretty good for what most people do, but if you really want to fly, you can sort of put a story around it, but it's getting old. What besides cache? Besides cache. So you could talk about, well, the bus speed. Well, yeah, but it's not really cheaper to do the faster bus Pentium 3 versus the Celeron, so that you quickly get into territory where it's really back to blue crystals, at which point all the technologists in the room kind of just tune out because they don't really want to think that way. Anyway, if you haven't seen blue crystals kind of discussions, sooner or later you will. To me, it's a sign of a maturing technology. This is right. If there's real value in there, it kind of leaps out at you, and you don't have to go looking for it. And if you start running into, why are people going to keep buying this thing? Let's give them new and interesting reasons that don't necessarily have reality behind them. That's not as much fun. All right, so my claim is what we need to be doing is watching for the intersection between what the technology can actually do, what's it afford, what kind of products are affordable, and what buyers will want, and then sell that vision to the rest of the company. Because as I've already shown, I hope, that vision's not going to come from somebody else. You're not going to visit some company and they're going to say, I know what you should be designing. Well, look at this interesting idea, and you go, wow, that's great. Occasionally you learn neat stuff. People are smart, but you can't really go looking for wholesale visions. They're not out there like that. Instead, you have to synthesize one on the basis of the inputs that you find and what you believe the technology can do and what people want out of it. And after that, pay careful attention to what you can get away with. Pay attention to things like leakage and noise and power and wireless. All of that stuff, that entire list down there, the sub-bullet here, is new from my experience. I mean, in 1991, 92, none of those would have been on there, right? And nowadays, if they're not on your list, then you're not going to turn out a very good chip. So my final claim is I don't think the ride is over in terms of the computer industry, not at all. But I think autopilot days are. When you just say, make the CPU faster, and they will be the path to your door. I think we've ridden Moore's Law to the point where the autopilot has to be disengaged, and we have to start thinking about where the right new directions are. I like, personally, this laptop is a Centrino laptop. And I worked on Pentium 4. So I didn't buy a Centrino willingly. I bought it because I think that's the right thing to do. I think it's the right direction. I like emphasis on low power and mobility. That's my take on it. You have to sort of reach your own conclusions. But anything that isn't pointed at direct high power performance is sort of still renegade with respect to what the big companies are doing. So that's what I'm proposing to you guys too. I think that's the next steps is people sort of stepping off the old bandwagon and finding the right direction. So, any questions or comments? Or?
You were saying that you didn't mention a clock rate. Are you saying that unusually high clock rates in Intel or blue crystals? You're not willing to admit it.
I don't want to say. Well, I'm willing to admit it. If I actually think if blue crystals are pointing this way, then it's in that general direction. But what I intended to do with the clock rate on the Pentium 4 was to strike a balance between what the general buying public was paying attention to when they bought machines, while not getting embarrassingly out of sync with what it actually delivered. I do want it to be a faster machine. We as technologists, yeah, well, But it's like if I give you 50% faster clock and I only bought you 25% more performance with it, if that's all there was to it, I still like that balance. I start getting heartburn when I say, well, it also cost you a lot more power. It made the complexity of the machine a lot higher. That meant that the average performance that it exhibits on any random app is going to be more variance. I mean, the standard deviation gets worse. All of those things are what give me heartburn. And so in the Pentium 4, the intention was to establish a competitive clock rate and then try to fill in behind it with reality. I don't feel bad about the Pentium 4 per se. I don't like anything after it. And that was one of the reasons I don't work there anymore. I had a problem convincing people like Craig Barrett that we had established this beachhead and said, while you've got this, you need to take it and use it as a starting point to launch in a different direction. You can't keep pounding on this because other people are smart too. If it's just a matter, if Pentium 4 succeeds brilliantly and the world says, by God, I'm going to reward whoever has the highest clock rate, then every competitor on the planet is going to go design clock rates at the same speed. They can do it, same as we did. And as soon as they do, we're going to follow each other in a commodity spiral down into the charcoal regime. And I said, we have spotted you a few years, but we did not give you an inviolable lead. Now, what are you going to do with it? And at the time, the reaction was, we are the people that set the product direction. You are the people that implement them. Go implement faster clocks. We said, I respectfully decline to do that, sir. And but the Centrino team, showed up about maybe a year later, and I think did a reasonably credible job. I don't think they went nearly as far as Transmeta did, for example, which I think was a really neat thing to try. But it was in the same general direction, and I think that direction's the right one. So, yeah, so Pentium 4, it's in terms of efficiency, you can beat us bloody. We deserve it. But I do think that as I said, I think you have to design products knowing what people are, trying to anticipate what people are going to buy. And if it's clock rate, you ignore that at your peril. So
that is a mid-level product.
Mid-level.
You don't have between the Centrino and the high clock rate version.
Yeah, we have a double. So we have a Wendy's double. Yeah.
So I heard your opinion about IA64. What is your opinion about 64 bits itself?
Well, I think it's inevitable that we're going to all move to 64-bit architectures. It doesn't cost enough more to do 64 bits that it's out of reach economically, and therefore we will all move to them. Okay, that's a given. So even some relatively intelligent people say ridiculous stuff when it comes to 64 bits. Oh, it's twice as fast because it's 64 bits. Every time I hear that, I get this brain headache. It's 64 bits to me, two different things, right? One is addressing. We definitely need more addressing. It's really easy to take the curve of what virtual addressing has been needed over all the years of 40 years, say, and say, wow, look at that slope. We're out of gas right here. And the window's only about 4 years wide. I mean, yeah, there's some uncertainty, but it's not 50 years wide. It's only a few. And you go, okay, there's no reason to think this trend is going to stop just because it's convenient for x86 to stop it. So, yeah, the demand will be there. So the addressing, absolutely. You're going to need extended addressing. And we've had extended physical addressing for several years now, by the way. It hasn't been 32 bits since 1996 or so. As for data sets, what do you need 64-bit registers? Yes, you need at least one so that you can do intelligent address, pointer arithmetic. But do you have to switch to an entire so that all your integer registers are 64 bits? That's not obvious to me. Now, I think, I'm kind of 50-50 on it, but maybe 51-49 because I think we still have a lot of transistors available. 1 billion transistors are coming up. It's not going to take too long. We're going to get there. Making a register twice as wide isn't that expensive anymore when you get to that. So it's not going to be, yeah, you could say maybe it's going to hurt my clock rate, but you won't be able to say it takes up too much die space. And when you get to that point, yeah, it'll probably just be simpler to have 64-bit everything. So what I'm suggesting is we're probably going to do it, but not for the right reasons. See what I'm saying?
Well, it's also a software issue.
Definitely a software issue. Yeah. But as soon as, either you believe that Microsoft will do, as soon as they put one out that knows, an operating system that knows how to do that, that's a de facto, there you go. Linux will probably do it first. There you go. And then we'll find out whether Linux has the ability to really, make that stick and drive the market. I think there will come a time, I hope there will become a time when Linux has that kind of clout. I don't know if it's yet, but.
Any other comments?
I have a question about what you're counting performance as. Because CPU performance is, sort of the number of additions or multiplications or divisions you can do per second on one side. On the other hand, it's the number of bytes you can push through the machine at a given per second, that is the I/O throughput. And that's actually much more interesting and much more significant, and is basically still a bottleneck on almost all these machines.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think it's partly I think what led to that outcome, I agree with you completely on the premise, and I think what led to that was the fact that designing CPUs was so lucrative that people like Intel pumped that axis of the computer system way out of proportion to all the rest. So now in the case of the Pentium IV, for example, you have 500 clock cycle memory latency, which you attempt to make up for with 3 levels of caches and clever predictions of everything. And if you just step back from that entire mess and say, what is that all about? Wasn't there some better way? If we were starting from scratch to have a computing engine do the following thing on my screen, maybe it would look a whole lot different, look more like what Bill's working on, or people that say, if you could just throw out all the old general purpose x86 garbage and start over with just the basic, how do I stream instructions through this, how would I stream data through it, and what kind of throughput could I achieve if I did all that just strictly in terms of technology, not in terms of economics. There's a pretty big difference. There's a huge difference. I would personally put a lot more of my effort into the I/O. I agree with you. The machine that I just built, that's one of the reasons I bought that particular CPU. It wasn't so much for things like the hyper-threading. It was because it had the 800 megahertz frontside bus. And then I even bought a serial ATA drive for the first time because it had lower latency. So it doesn't make a huge difference, but, you do what you can. Pardon?
Just one?
Well, I have 4 other drives in the machine, but they're old and I'm cheap, so.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, you had a lot of exponential graphs. One you didn't have is actually IPC per transistor, which is actually, where the exponential is in the denominator, declining rapidly.
Yeah.
And the point, actually, of that observation is that, I mean, what could you be doing with those transistors that we're not doing? I mean, it's the efficiency of modern microarchitectures is declining rapidly if you measure it as IPC per transistor.
That's true, absolutely. So do I have to design a compatible processor, or do I get to play what's best for the technology? Because I'll end up with radically different answers.
Sure. I mean,
like if
that's what's interesting.
Yeah, I know. Well, but that's kind of the problem. If it has to be compatible with an existing architecture, that puts real strong constraints on the kinds of creativity that you can devote. For example, one of the reasons that there's so much cache on these chips is because A, it's easy to replicate, right? B, it doesn't leak that much, right? Leakage power is horrible right now, and it's going to get far worse. And if we can use the transistors in a sense that we can replicate it easily and it doesn't kill me on the power that's going to leak, well, that's a pretty alluring thing. Even though, as technologists, we can look at it and say, what is the average reuse of each? Anytime I stick something in the cache, how many times do I reuse it? It's embarrassingly small. But there are other reasons why we do that. If we devoted all of those transistors to nothing but execution, and you found me a way to feed bits in the side at optical rates or something, I don't know, you go ahead, tell me how to do that. Yeah, we could, orders of magnitude are sitting there to be had.
Isn't that probably why there's a trend towards chip-level multiprocessors? Do you somewhat escape some of that?
Is there a trend? Well, I guess in servers there are, yeah. And if you consider multi-threading on a single chip to be the same kind of going after throughput instead of time to solution, that's, yeah. Well, it's the way I view it is when you get to this point in the maturation of the industry, and you've played this game so many times that you don't see any obvious wins sitting out in front, you start looking to the sides, and you say, is there any other games I haven't played over there? Multi-threading was one of those. That's, that idea had gotten kicked around as early as the 80s with respect to CPUs, but it wasn't worth doing until we sort of said, there's nothing that's really kind of cheap, and there's nothing really compelling down the mainstream, so we might as well play that game. Donald Norman writes lots of books about how human interfaces sort of drive you towards design decisions, and we don't do a lot of them very well, like there's switches. And he would like these because there's arrows on them, and it tells you which way they go. But if he sees light switches, like 3 at a time next to each other, he hates those because he says, what is it going to do? I don't know. And it's in that same sense that we do what we do for, he thinks the x86 is going to die because we're going to hit an absolute wall of complexity. He thinks Microsoft Windows already hit that and just didn't know that it's dead. 4 gigs of source code is an indicator that it's dead, but I think Windows Millennium was absolutely certifiably dead, but they kind of switched to another horse and started writing it instead. But he actually wrote a book that said, I predict Intel and Microsoft are both dead because every time they add more complexity, it adds to what was already there, and sooner or later they won't be able to drive it anymore. I don't think he's entirely wrong about that one. I really do think we keep adding complexity, and sooner or later the differential between what you can still do with a compatible processor and what was available to start over and just do what the transistors want, if that gap gets too big, it could be that there's some wiggle room there. In fact, I think that's where NVIDIA came from. The 3D graphics is an example of a place where if you can dedicate the flops to one specific task, boy, you can leave the CPU in the dust. And now they're making them more programmable, which is a trend that Intel has not gone unnoticed. Have you seen that? There's like 64K iCaches in those things now.
Yeah, double the number. When you do a new, graphics unit, you basically get the full impact of all your extra transistors plus FIPOC, right?
Yeah. The only problem that they have is, I think, at some point your eyes don't get any better, and if they can improve that problem.
Direct connections.
Yeah, right into your.
What's the impact of the optical interconnects that Intel's been touting?
Oh, speed of light, man. I read it on the internet. Did you read that? It cracked me up. Pat Gelsinger was quoted.
Expect that to really show up.
I loved it. No, I don't know that.
Another marketing part, another blue.
I just love the quote. The quote said, with this new optical stuff, we'll be able to route signals at the speed of light. What the hell have we been doing all this time? Must be a misquote.
It's different than it is elsewhere.
Yeah, the refractive index.
Okay, any other questions? Comments?
How powerful is that compatibility instruction set?
Powerful.
Like how can you have to stay within that to compete?
Put it this way, it's incredibly hard to even throw out old obsolete instructions. It is far, far less risk to just implement the damn thing and grit your teeth and say, I know no one's ever going to use this. Was it C-flush? Was that one of them, Randy? It was like there was some old crufty, even A20M. Remember that bit? The stupid A20M bit from the old DOS days. You can't, you mess with this stuff at your peril, and it's just every time you do a new chip, you have so many more transistors, and you just say, this is not the time to take a risk with that part of the machine. So by golly, I'll just implement it again and hold my nose. And so it's really, you can add instructions. That's not so hard. But throwing old ones out is really tough. Even messing with the corner cases, which I'm sure Dave discovered at Transmet. There are corner cases of where the architect's book says, this is a don't care or we don't tell you. It's undefined. Well,
Undecoded is
undecoded is another one. There's a whole bunch of them where it says you really could make your own decision about it, but they don't mean it. They're not trying to fool you necessarily, but it's stuff like you put out the 46 one and it does what it does. People write software to get it working on the 46. You come out with the Pentium, and now you look in the book and you say, we said that was undefined. It would be more convenient for me on this generation to do the opposite of what the 46 did. So you bravely go and do it. Now you discover you broke some old software that just by accident happened to use the corner case that they weren't supposed to, but no one noticed because that was the only silicon that was out there. And now what do you do? So in order to forestall that, you kind of bias the design team towards always do what the old one did unless you have a compelling reason not to. And that bias shows up in lots and lots of places. There was a place when we were doing the P6 that the old branch, the 46s did this auto prefetch, and then they brought instructions back and it sat in some kind of front porch until it was ready. And P6, the Pentium guys ran across this and said, oh my gosh, in order to follow what the 46 did, we have to stand on our heads and notice the case where these instructions are already sitting there and it's a form of self-modifying code, but we can't react to it yet. The 46 would not have seen it. So we have to notice where that window is and obey the window. And boy, is that hard. So we thought you P6 guys should know. And we went, we can't do that no matter what you say. Our front end is God knows where. It's 30 instructions down the road. We can't do that. So I went up to Microsoft and found the guy who had taken advantage of this little facility, who had written Microsoft Flight Simulator. The guy who wrote that, one particular version of it, he thought it would be a neat anti-piracy thing to sort of take advantage of that wacky little corner case. And I said, I beg you not to do that anymore because I can't give you those semantics. They're broken. You weren't supposed to do that. And he goes, oh, yeah, that idea didn't work anyway. It's okay. No. There's crazy stuff like that you know, that you have to carry around. And if you break something, man, it could be really painful. Yes, Dave?
Question. When I think of IBM, they had a principle of operations manual for IBM 360, and they religiously followed it. It really defined what would happen. With Intel, when you went from 36 to 46 to P5 to P6, things did change because they hadn't been so religiously nailed down. Mm-hmm. In particular, the one question I have on the P6 would be condition codes. You know, you can choose to say these are undefined, but usually chips would set them one way or the other. The P6 made a pretty major modification in condition code settings. In particular, I think there were some bits where it was basically unaffected, which was kind of a new thing to have done, which meant you have to know the prior state of what was going on. Was that intentional, or
do you remember that? I remember exactly. I did that. There were some of the 486s that did exactly that. That was actually compatibility, but there were two different processors, and we got to choose one of them. I agree. The unaffected condition. That's, by the way, the reason why it was easier to do an out-of-order x86 and an out-of-order 68K or an out-of-order VAX. But the x86 has fewer unaffected condition codes. There were far fewer than there were for the VAX or the 68K.
Yeah, believe that.
We actually had an all-day summit where we pulled all the x86 experts of the company together, and we ran them through all the places where we were worried that we were messing up something x86 related, because when we first did P6, none of us, with very few exceptions, none of us had ever done an x86 at all. And in fact, many of us, including me, had studiously avoided the damn thing because it was ugly. So item by item, we said, okay, this is what the 46 did, this is what the Pentium did, this is what we're proposing to do. Do any of you guys see anything wrong with this plan? And it was a reasonably effective way to resolve this thing. You know, people would say, yes, I think that should work, or there's no way you're going to get bitten badly, or whatever. And at least it gave us a list, a working list of things to, you know, go off and test. And the other thing that we found really useful was Cyrix. They were pretty brave, and they went off and diddled all kinds of stuff, and then we could take their chip and test it and say, oh, look at this, you know, it still passes this piece of code. So we didn't know that. It only seems fair. I mean, it gets done to us, too.
Was the architecture validation suite that Intel uses came out of the P6 project or earlier project?
Oh, well, the architecture, first of all, there was no architecture model at all until P6 came along. That was you only just used the previous chip, and we didn't think, we couldn't design that way. So we first commissioned a guy to go write a model for the x86. And he read all the manuals, and he wrote the code. Unfortunately, his idea of C code was was to conserve white space. So you can see where this is going. He would indent by at most one space, and sometimes not at all, because it was nice and dense if you just sort of went this way with the code. And so no one could read it. I think at one point, I think it might have been Andy, said, you know, if you run his code through lint, you can almost read it after that. And so indent. And so after that, we would all sort of cheat on it. But anyway, this guy became one of the chief microcoders on the part, and he was sufficiently diligent there. He pretty much got the darn thing right. So you know, he would have been a dangerous man if he could actually code. But anyway, that model became kind of the gold standard in the company, and it became maintained and had official people donated to sort of run it and things like that. So then we did. So yeah, that was the P6. Even the performance models prior to P6 were done in basically spreadsheet. You know, just add up.
Validation suite.
Yeah, well, we went around and looked to see if we could just buy one off the shelf to help test.
All these defunct x86 companies.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot. There were some out there, but it wasn't clear how good they were until after the project was over. So.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much.